Hello, Boulder Bookstore and readers everywhere. I am Kris Spisak, author most recently of The Baba Yaga Mask, and I'm honored to do this Q&A with you all. Now let's dive in. Can you tell us briefly about your novel with no spoilers? Of course. So The Baba Yaga Mask is book club fiction, a dual timeline story moving between the contemporary and historical Ukraine 1941. I never thought of how timely this book would be when my book deals just started rolling. It's a bit absurd that this story, where one of the major plot lines is this moment in Ukrainian history when their identity is stolen from them from foreign powers, one after the other, it's a bit poignant. But what is my story about? So that is one of the plot lines. My story is about a grandmother who lands in Europe after having not been there since World War II. She steps off the plane and she disappears. And two sisters stateside who are on a mission to find her. These two sisters, one of whom is a super mom in everything that means, and one of whom is a free spirit. They are frequently at odds, and they are off on this wild goose chase across Eastern Europe, multiple countries, trying to track down their grandmother to see if she's sick, to see if something happened to her, or to see if she is up to something she just might be. And through their wild goose chase, they are uncovering slowly their own family history, their own cultural traditions of being Ukrainian, everything they know about Ukrainian dance and Ukrainian art and Ukrainian symbolism, tied up with their own newly discovered family story. So that is what my book is about. Okay, next question. What inspired you to write this book? So I am a Ukrainian American. I am first generation American on my mother's side, and I always grew up hearing all of these stories about World War II in Ukraine. And I was one of those kids, and I know this is true for so many kids across so many cultures around the world, that I went to history classes waiting for the moment when my family story would be discussed. And I waited when history classes sometimes came close, but never quite got to the stories that I was really familiar with. And it hit me that it's not really well known about how Soviet forces took over most of Ukraine before World War II. And then there was this huge Ukrainian independence movement once again. And for 2 weeks in 1941, Ukraine was its own country for 2 weeks. And then Nazi Germany moved in. And it's this moment of fighting for independence amid a moment where other cultures are trying to squish your country's existence, your heritage's reality. And it's always been a profound piece of my own family story, but I had never seen it discussed in fiction, so I guess I had to do it. So that's where this story came from. I knew I always wanted to write it, and it ended up coming out in this dual timeline story with these two sisters in the contemporary world. And I'm really proud of how it came together, so I hope you check it out. Next question. Did you do any research on the Ukrainian history and folklore to write this book? Absolutely. And this is something that I think we all should do when you know your own family history and your own family stories that have been passed down through generations. But then you want to know, what is the true historical context? What is the basis in the world history for these stories, and what has been perhaps exaggerated and gone in like a giant game of telephone and changed and morphed over the years. So that's what I did. I did a lot of research into Ukrainian history to figure out what was true versus what I've been told versus what world history actually can uncover for us. I worked with academics across Europe. I worked with academics across the United States, just to make sure I was getting my own heritage correct, to make sure that I was getting history true, to make sure I was being authentic to the other cultures that are discussed in this book, because authenticity is important, and getting your truth correct is important even when you're working in the historical fiction space. So yes, I did a lot of historical research. I did a lot of cultural research, even though I am Ukrainian. I just wanted to make sure we all dig deep into that, because it's important to get details as right as we can, even though our own experiences vary. And when it comes to folklore, as you can guess from the title of the Baba Yaga Mask, a Baba Yaga is an Eastern Ukrainian witch, but she is so much more complicated than just a evil cackling witch of Disney creation. And yes, I love folklore, I love storytelling, and she is an interesting character, let me tell you. So yes, I played a lot with folklore in my research of this story. Next question. Can you tell us about your writing process? Well, for the Baba Yaga mask, I think I might be a little bit of a believer that the world works in mysterious ways, because I've been working on this story for a number of years. I actually started working on it in 2014. I had a couple years prior to that been traveling in Eastern Europe trying to see all of these locations, because I knew there was a story there, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And it was in 2014 it hit me, this concept of a grandmother stepping off a plane and disappearing. And how would we handle that? And who would be the characters who are chasing this grandmother? So I started playing with this. And little by little, this story slowly came out. There were bits and spurts of this where I would give myself deadlines. I have a critique partner, which is fabulous, where every month or so we trade 30 pages and we have a deadline with each other. It's a bit like a gym buddy system that no matter what, we have to give each other some pages. Are we always perfect at this? Not at all, but it's great to have a obligation, a deadline that's more than just something on my own internal calendar. So she really forced me to pull out this story piece by piece. As someone who writes, my first three books have been writing reference on how to do write your family story, on how to empower your communications, on how to empower your own novel writing, because I'm an editor by trade. I'm an independent fiction editor helping others pull out their stories. So juggling my own project amid client projects, amid my own other publications has always been something to work on, because we all have our complicated lives. But this is a story I knew had to be told. So between my critique partner and just deadlines, I made sure it was ready. I thought it was ready a couple years ago, but I couldn't quite find the right publisher at that time. And I just find it fascinating that when I signed this deal for this book and we decided to put the colors of the Ukrainian flag on the cover, I didn't realize that anyone in the world would actually know the colors of the Ukrainian flag. I didn't realize that publishing this book in April 2022 would be such a moment in world history, when people were thinking about Ukrainian stories and were curious about Ukrainian history and Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian identity and feminism. I had no idea, but again, the world works in mysterious ways. So that's how that happened. Okay, next question. Do you think your story can help people understand the Ukrainian people and their history better? I accidentally just answered that. Yes, absolutely. Who we are says so much about how we live our lives, about our mindset, about our own country, about our own families, about our generations that trickle down their influence upon us and who we become. I say often, I think in the book and otherwise, that generations are often a bit like nesting dolls, these Matryoshka dolls. So you can see these wooden dolls that go one smaller than the other, smaller than the other, smaller than the other. Families are a bit like nesting dolls. We give each other shape, yet we don't define who we each are. We hold each other strong and protected, but we are still each our own independent individual. And I think through the course of this story, that look at generations of a family, of Ukrainian culture, hopefully is captured. And yes, the history of Ukraine, I had no idea when all of this was coming together that the last major moment of millions of people flooding out of Ukraine under the terror of war would be duplicated when this book hit shelves. It's surreal, honestly. I don't even know what to say about that reality. But there we are. And next question. All right, next question is, what have you been reading during the pandemic to stay hopeful? And I love this question because it is such an essential piece of who we are in our identities, that the more we learn about other cultures, the more I find hope about the world. There are so many terrors of the present day. There are so many terrors in history, but there is always hope. And I think I have been doing more multicultural reading during the pandemic than anything else, looking for my own personal knowledge gaps. whether that is people who live in my own country, whether that is people who live around the world or have different belief systems. I have been trying to read as diversely as possible, looking for holes in my own knowledge. And through that course, I feel like I am becoming a stronger, more empathetic person. We all have our sweet spots and our favorite genres that we fall into, but reading widely changes us and helps us see the world in a more profound way. So I encourage you to pick up a book about a culture you do not know, no matter whether that is a thriller, no matter whether that is a romance, no matter whether that is something for your book club or any genre you can think of. There are a lot of amazingly talented writers these days, writing from so many places. And there are so many stories to hear. So pick up stories from somewhere new, because I think you will be all the better for it. That's been my approach lately. All right, is there anything else you want us to know about your book? Yes, if you go to babayagamask.com, and again, Baba Yaga is that Eastern European witch, BABAYAGA.com. If you go there, you can have free downloads of Ukrainian art symbols, because some things like Ukrainian Easter eggs, like Matryoshka dolls, they can be beautiful. But there are stories and manifestos and dreams hiding within the artwork in the symbols. So there's so much to explore in those. I go into it a lot in the Baba Yaga Mask, but I have free downloads available at thebabayagamask.com if you would like to learn more about Ukrainian art symbols. Also there, you can learn more about how I am doing a bit of a call to action for book clubs to actually help the people of Ukraine right now. In this moment, again, I didn't realize, couldn't dream, couldn't fathom of the world where this book would come out. But because I am speaking so much about Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture, my own Ukrainian background, I am doing a lot of visits with book clubs, but also there's so much that you and your book club could do to actually help the people of Ukraine. There are humanitarian aid efforts, and a lot of the details about that are also on the babayagamask.com. I encourage you just to think about how you can possibly help. There are so many stories in the world that we need to hear and understand. This is just one of them. However, there are a lot of people who need help right now because they have lost homes, because they have been displaced, and there's things that we can do that are very simple to just help people far away. So I encourage you to learn more about that, whether that's as an individual with your book club or otherwise. All right, the last question is a reading from my book. Again, this is a reading from the Baba Yaga Mask. I said that this was a dual timeline story. This chapter is from the historical focus on Vera, who's the grandmother in the contemporary day, but this is Vera as a teenager, May 1941 in Western Ukraine. The paint on Lesia's wooden doll had dried nearly a week ago. The twins had talked through their plans for their own, guiding Lesia and their mother's brushes to add their dark blonde curls, flowered red and yellow scarves upon their heads to match the aprons tied around blue dresses. One nesting doll had a favorite baby doll, the other a small plate of cookies. Vera sat beside her mother, feeling tied to the chair. The tiny paintbrush had been put into her hand. The paint had been placed before her on the table. "We need to finish these Matryoshka today." Her mother's voice contrasted starkly with the twins singing under the table at their feet, the same song over and over again. Cuckoo, cuckoo, petichka mala. Cuckoo, cuckoo, small bird. Cuckoo, cuckoo, small bird. Vera and her mother had the two biggest nesting dolls in the unpainted set that Uncle Ola had given them. Halia, the youngest by 30 minutes, would go inside Helena, the elder twin. Helena inside Lesia. Lesia inside Vera, and Vera inside their mother. The responsibility of the biggest was to take care of the others, but Vera wondered if an inner nesting doll had ever wanted so badly to break free. "Your father said that Uncle Ola will be returning soon." Her mother painted the biggest Matryoshka's face. The eyes were stunning, the precise blue that could bear down on her oldest daughter, under eyelashes as fine and pointed as needles. The mouth, though, wasn't right, a flattened streak. This doll pressed her lips shut, whether forcing her voice to be silent or combating the draw of a well-known sweet tooth, Vera couldn't decide. Vera pushed back her chair. "You, stay," her mother snapped. "You cannot move until your doll is done." She nudged her chair back into place. After dipping her brush in the yellow paint that still smelled of mustard seed, Vera swirled a few flowers on her doll's dress. Upstairs, Ivan had banged and thumped as he packed his bags, readying to return to the city, to rejoin his peers in the Lviv Symphony. "What are you putting in the hands?" Forcing pleasant conversation in less than pleasant moments was a specialty of her mother's. "I still don't know." "Why not a rooster?" The doll's bare hands in front of her had the space for a colorful bird. The idea wasn't a terrible one, a rooster for fulfillment of wishes. She could almost see it there with its tail feathers in green and yellow and red, but she didn't want to admit that to her mother. No, not a rooster. "Some yarn and needles. You have a talent for design." Her mother spoke without looking away from her own work. Her brush added a touch of pink to her doll's cheeks, and then she wiped it off with a rag on the table. "Uncle Ola said these dolls had to tell our stories. I'm so much more than sewing. And I'm more than a mother, and your sister is more than a friendly girl with welcoming bread." Vera's eyes raised. Vera's eyebrows raised. She didn't think they really were. She started to scoot out of her chair, but stopped herself. May I go get a book from my room for ideas?" "Come right back." She shook off the invisible ropes as she stood. From the hall, she could see the truck of Soviet soldiers outside still hadn't moved down the hill. The soldiers' uniforms were crisp, if dusty, their expressions sharp. Her Uncle Ola had called them murderers everywhere but to their faces. Ivan was convinced that Galicia, their region of western Ukraine, would be free of their presence soon. Her father said they needed to be calm, to wait and see. Vera had always been terrible at waiting. She crossed past her father's study with its thick leather ledger full of notes on his bees open on his desk. She traced her fingertips along the stairs' wooden railing as she slipped upstairs. In Ivan's room, clothes and music sheets lay across the bed, covering every space but his empty, open suitcase. A suit and vest lay across his bed, a hat upon the dresser. His viola leaned against the wall near the door, more sheet music scattered on the floor beside it. A rich yellow ribbon stuck out of a thin book on his dresser. The floorboards creaked underneath her as she stepped into the messy space. Pencils littered the floor, folded clothing piled on a chair, a sketch of the inside of a beehive decorated the wall over his bed. Vera knew the smell of him would linger for days after he'd gone, that mix of honey and wax for his viola. If boys painted nesting dolls, Ivan's would certainly hold his viola. But boys were always so much more than just one thing, Vera knew. And it goes on, obviously. But here's the book, The Baba Yaga Mask. It is my fourth book. My most recent, I did have a video for you all at Boulder Bookstore a couple years back. That was the Family Story Workbook, which you see here, which is all about drawing out your own family stories. But again, I'm Kris Spisak, and I've been honored to chat with you. And happy reading, everybody.